Behind those bars, locked away, is an iron box. Inside the box is a silvered casket. Inside the casket, a piece of cloth 14 feet long. A cloth which bears the mysterious imprint of a crucified man. A cloth said to be the very shroud which wrapped Christ's body in the tomb nearly 2,000 years ago. Since 1694, the Holy Shroud of Turin has been kept here, high above the altar of the Royal Chapel of Turin Cathedral. It is owned by the ex-king of Italy, Umberto of Savoy, whose ancestors, the Italian dukes of Savoy, built the shrine especially for it. It is regarded as so holy that it has been shown publicly only 4 times in the last 100 years.
Ed è per questo che noi dobbiamo essere grati ai Duchi di Savoia.
It seems incredible even to suppose that the linen cloth in which Jesus was wrapped in the tomb could have survived to this day, and even more incredible that it could bear an image of Christ as he appeared after the crucifixion. But that is the claim we're about to examine. In the 20th century, we've come to rely on science to give us simple answers to what before were universal mysteries or questions of faith. And now, after many years, we have the results of research into the shroud, carried out here in Turin and by scientists and scholars all over the world. And their discoveries have been stranger than anyone could have expected. For 4 centuries, the shroud has been kept here in the North Italian city of Turin, and once every 30 or 40 years, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims have flocked here for those rare occasions when the shroud is publicly displayed, to catch a distant glimpse of the cloth's ghostly image, the image of the front and back of a man laid out in death. A faint image, but with sufficient detail to convince pilgrims they were looking at the very shroud of Christ. Bloodstains, as of nailing through the feet. And hands. A wound in the side. Trickles of blood as from a crown of thorns. And a back covered with the marks of a savage scourging. But probably most convincing of all, the unique and eerie quality of the whole image. Also on the cloth are patches from an accident that befell it long before it came to Turin, when the Dukes of Savoy kept it on the other side of the Alps, in France, at Chambéry. This was then the capital of Savoy, and the shroud was kept here in the Sainte-Chapelle. A Duchess Margaret of Austria had bequeathed upon the shroud a silver casket, and to fit inside, the cloth had to be carefully folded several times. Then, in 1532, although the cloth was badly scarred, the image itself was virtually untouched, and nuns were able to sew in the patches visible to this day. Some 80 years before the fire, the Dukes of Savoy acquired the shroud from a French family called de Charnay, who kept it in Liray, a tiny village in the heart of France. This man, Geoffrey de Charnay, exhibited the shroud in Liray in 1389. He inherited it from his father, another Geoffrey de Charnay, a knight killed in battle against the English at Poitiers. And with his death, the chain of certainty about the shroud's origins mysteriously comes to an end. Liray. Why should the burial shroud of Jesus Christ suddenly appear here? Forgery of religious relics was all too common in the Middle Ages, and at the very time of the de Charnays, a bishop actually made this accusation towards the shroud in a forceful letter to the Pope, an accusation revived at the turn of this century, when the shroud may have been dismissed altogether, were it not for an incident that took place in Turin on May 28, 1898.
Subito, subito! Non perdere tempo! Grazie. Sposta la lampada.
For the first time, permission had been given to photograph the shroud during one of the rare expositions. And this man, Secondo Pia, was to focus the world's attention on a new and unexpected discovery.
Spingimi avanti. Dai, dai.
A lawyer by profession, Pia was a dedicated enthusiast of the new science of photography, and this was a unique occasion for him.
Avanti, avanti. Su, basta.
In a few days, the shroud would be locked away for another generation.
Daniele, a casa. Subito.
Here I had discovered that somehow the image on the shroud itself was a negative. Light and shade were reversed. Later and better photographs of the whole shroud confirmed the discovery in even greater detail. The whole body could be seen much more clearly in negative. Was it, after all, possible that Christ had, in some incomprehensible way, left behind an image of himself? Certainly it was very difficult to explain how a medieval forger could have concocted a photographic negative some 5 centuries before the first camera. At the very least, the shroud was the oldest and strangest photograph in the world. The sudden availability of detailed photographs meant that medical men could examine closely the apparent wounds of crucifixion and scourging. One of the first to do so was Yves Delage, a member of the French Academy, who was astounded at the anatomical perfection of the image, far superior to anything produced in the Middle Ages. Not surprisingly, Rome has been the center of one of the most detailed medical studies. Here, Monsignor Giulio Ricci, who now teaches the study of the shroud, has spent 30 years investigating every tiny mark in an attempt to positively identify the man on the shroud as Jesus Christ. But the identification of a body is the specialist task of the forensic pathologist. And here, in Los Angeles, they have the grim distinction of possessing the busiest forensic medical department in the world.
Dr. Buckland, please report to the
How you doing? How are
room.
you?
Incoming homicide.
Dr. Robert Bucklin, forensic pathologist at Los Angeles for many years, is probably one of the most experienced investigators in this field.
To a person experienced in the examination of injuries, this is a particularly interesting case. Instead of having an adult human body to examine, we have images of the front of the body and of the back of the body. Both of these show injuries of various types on the body, all of which are shown in such detail and clarity that a forensic examination can be made. The body is that of an adult male, and the image as it appears here measures 5 feet 10 inches in length, and the estimated body weight is 175 pounds. The body appears to be about 30 to 35 years of age. On the body is a variety of injuries, ranging all the way from simple contusions to large areas of puncture where there has been an outflow of blood. The wounds can best be divided into 5 categories. The first group concerns injuries which appear on the back. These range from the top of the shoulders down to the areas of the calf. They consist of double puncture type wounds which appear to go in a direction from lateral toward medial and downward. They have obviously been made by some implement with sharp edges, and the implement was applied to the skin in a flicking fashion in such a way as to pull out bits of skin.
Ve ne faccio vedere un tipo, uno dei tanti di quelli documentati.
I will show you one type, one of the many documented, on which you can see the ends weighted with tachilli, as the Romans called them. These were heavy balls made of metal or bone. As you can see, this whip is divided into 3 parts, which, when applied, naturally multiplies the number of strokes. If we apply this to the photos of the shroud, for example to this one showing the calves, and if we put these small metal balls of identical size over it, you have a graphic documentation of the marks left by one of the strokes of the whip, and one only. On the left calf, they are the same size and from the same direction. Therefore, these 2 strokes were given by the same scourger. You can now see something even more disturbing by studying the shroud. There are trickles of blood caused by the metal balls which were sharpened. They had spikes at the ends. Applied to the life-size photograph, the proportions and measurements are identical. Complete examination of the Holy Shroud gives us 2 scourges, because the directions converge, one from the right and one from the left, and the number of strokes is excessive, more than 120.
Also present on the back image are two areas of abrasion located over the shoulder blades. These are caused by a heavy object resting across the back.
Immaginate una trave che al tempo
When talking of the cross of Jesus, imagine a beam that at the time of Pontius Pilate was put across the shoulders and tied on with a rope. Marks of this beam can be seen in the area of the left and upper right shoulder blades. These are contusions and lacerations from the scourging wounds, which spread under the weight of the beam.
The second group of injuries are those which appear on the face and on the head. On the right cheek, over the malar area, is a swelling which has resulted in partial closing of the right eye. There is also an area on the nose where there is a separation and possible fracture of the nasal cartilage. On the tip of the nose is a small abrasion, possibly resulting from a fall where the nose came in contact with a hard object.
His fall was unavoidable and was one of the most common spectacles of those times. The consequences are very clear on the shroud. You can see the left and the right leg. The left leg at the kneecap has very bad laceration and contusion. It is evident that the left leg bent and hit against the stones.
In the forehead and in the scalp is a series of blood stains, one of which has the configuration of a figure 3. These appear not only on the front part of the forehead, but also on the back part of the scalp and high at the vertex of the head. They were made by sharp pointed objects which have projected below the skin and produced bleeding. Their configuration is such that the implement was like a cap which rested on the head.
This wound, corresponding to a crown of thorns, probably more than any other, identifies the man as Jesus Christ. The Gospels state clearly that the soldiers invented this torture for him alone. It was certainly not normal Roman procedure. A forger would have included such wounds, but would have shown them, as all artists did, as a circlet. Instead, the whole head is covered, suggesting a rough clump of thorns. Almost certainly what actually happened. Yet one more graphic detail indicating the shroud's authenticity.
The third group of injuries involve the area of the wrist and the forearms. In the left wrist is what appears to be a blood stain which has resulted from a puncture-type wound of the left wrist. This stain has two divergent streams which extend downward. If the left arm is moved laterally to a position where these two divergent streams are vertical as a result of gravity, we have the position of the arm at the time of the flow of blood. The blood stains which appear on the forearms are also consistent with two angles of blood flow. An injury to this part of the wrist will invariably damage the median nerve, whose function is to flex the thumb across the palm. It's interesting to note that there are no thumbs in these images. The next group of injuries are those about the feet, and they can best be seen on the dorsal image. The imprint of the right foot is pretty clear, and the heel and the toe are well defined. The left foot is less well defined. The left heel is elevated higher than the right heel, suggesting that the left foot was on top of the right instep and that a single spike was used to impale the 2 feet together.
Crucifixion took many different forms, each carefully designed to provide a slow, lingering death. The wounds on the shroud, particularly the blood flows on the arms, make it possible to accurately reconstruct the form of crucifixion used and illustrate the awful technical realities. Firstly, the nails pierced the wrists, which, contrary to the imagination of artists down the centuries, is the only place that will take the weight of a body. Suspended only by the arms, the victim would die much too quickly, probably within minutes of suffocation. So the feet have been nailed to provide the support necessary to extend the agony. The divergent streams of blood indicate two distinct positions. In the first, the weight is mainly on the wrists, with the body slumped. In the second position, to avoid suffocation, some of the weight is transferred to the feet, raising the chest and altering the angle of the arms. Thus, the victim was thrown from one excruciating pain to another, until exhaustion overcame or the legs were broken. It is even possible to calculate the final position on the cross.
The last of the injuries is an apparent wound to the side. Here, in addition to a large outflow of blood from the heart, there is also evidence of another thin, watery type substance, which is best seen on the dorsal image where blood has flowed across the lower part of the back and is separated from the heavier blood components. The markings on this image are so clear and so medically accurate that the pathological facts which they reflect concerning the suffering and death of the man depicted here are, in my opinion, beyond dispute.
During the last few years, an increasing number of scholars have developed a desire to find out more about the shroud. But Dr. John Robinson, Dean of Trinity College, Cambridge, was perhaps the last one would expect to take a deep interest. His books, particularly Honest to God, have earned him a reputation of being very much a skeptic.
Well, my interest in the shroud is primarily as a New Testament scholar, and I must confess that when I first investigated it, I was as skeptical of this relic as of any other, all of which, as far as I know, have been shown to be bogus. But the more one went into it, the more one realized there was so much about this thing that a forger would never really have thought of, and indeed that he would come up, I think, with a very different cloth from the one we now have, because he would have started from the evidence of the New Testament as interpreted by Christian tradition, and he would probably have envisaged the body of Jesus as having been wound round in a winding cloth, rather like an Egyptian mummy, with possibly a face cloth over the front, on which he would then have forged an image rather like the bogus St. Veronica's handkerchief. In fact, what we have fits extraordinarily well with the New Testament evidence, and from my point of view helps to make a great deal more sense of it than I saw before.
In 1973, the weave of the shroud was microscopically examined by a Turin scientific commission, and although no accurate placing could be obtained, it was found to be quite compatible with material woven on looms in the Middle East at the time of Christ. But the biggest surprise and most positive results came from the studies of a Swiss criminologist and botanist, a special investigator for European police forces, and an expert in the study and identification of pollens.
It is amazing that every flowering plant produces pollen of its own, which can be distinguished from any other pollen. I often employed the study of the microscopical dust in the garments of a suspect, on weapons, tools, or any other piece of evidence in order to find out where these objects had come from. As pollen grains have a very resistant outer wall, the so-called exine, so that they remain unchanged for thousands of years.
Dr. Fry was given an opportunity to study the shroud at first hand when, in 1973, he was asked to authenticate photographs of the cloth taken a few years earlier.
I remarked between the threads some dust particles, some of them looking like pollen grains or spores. At higher magnification, I was certain of it, and so I asked the competent authorities if it would be possible to take dust samples. I hoped by this examination to find out some details about the history of the shroud. Let me show you what I found. This here, for example, is from the beech, Fagus sylvatica, a plant growing in Central Europe and the northern parts of Europe. And here I have a pollen of Taxus baccata, the yew tree, a plant that is growing too in Northern Europe and Central Europe.
Altogether, Max Fry identified 12 pollens of European origin.
They only confirm what we already know, that the shroud was exposed to the open air in France and Italy. But then I came across this one. Linum mucronatum, and this one, Roemeria hybrida, Glautium grandiflorum, Onosma giganteum, Astragalus.
Pollens and fibers from 9 species of plants growing exclusively in this area were found on the shroud, indicating that Lire in France was not where it originated.
The presence of such a significant number of pollens from plants growing in Turkey leads me to one fundamental conclusion. At some time of its history, the shroud must have been exposed to the air in southern Turkey or the surroundings of Istanbul.
During the Dark Ages, when Rome had been overrun by barbarians, Constantinople remained unconquered, the capital of Eastern Christianity. Its emperors built up a priceless collection of Christian relics, and from here, in 1203, one French crusader had written that he had seen the Sidwan in which our Lord was wrapped. Was this Sidwan and the shroud one and the same? This was one of the questions that historian Ian Wilson set out to answer.
I began to consider the simple fact that the likeness of Christ that has come down to us through the centuries was surprisingly similar to the image visible on the shroud. Of course, this could mean that the forger, whoever he was, simply chose to copy the conventional likeness. But what if the shroud were genuine? I began to trace the likeness of Christ back through the centuries. The 15th century, the 14th century, the 13th century. Right back, in fact, as far as the 6th century, the likeness to the shroud image was quite unmistakable. But before this time, there was a surprising inconsistency. Many portraits of Christ were beardless. The Gospels give no indication of how Christ looked, so artists had no model to follow. I wondered, what was it that had brought about this sudden, dramatic, definitive likeness in Christ's portraits from the 6th century on? Could it have been the shroud? I found it intriguing that according to Eastern Christian tradition, this likeness was taken from the image on a strange and mysterious cloth found in the early 6th century, precisely where Max Fry showed the Turin shroud had once been, in southern Turkey.
The cloth was discovered here in the southern Turkish town of Edessa, now known as Urfa, or perhaps we should say rediscovered. Edessa was the earliest, and at that time one of the greatest eastern centers of Christianity. Cave tombs in the surrounding hillside were inhabited by thousands of hermits who came just to be close to the holy city. The citizens proudly claimed that Christianity in Edessa dated back to the very time of Jesus himself. They told the story of King Abgar V, who we know ruled in Edessa at the time of Christ. Now Abgar was stricken with a disease. Hearing of the miracles of Jesus, he wrote to him asking that he might come to Edessa and cure him. But Jesus did not come. In his place came a disciple named Addai, bearing with him a cloth, having a miraculous image of the Savior himself. Abgar was cured, and believing on Jesus, he brought Christianity to his city. Abgar was succeeded by his son, Manu, who returned to the old pagan gods, and the persecuted Christians hastily hid the sacred cloth away. Around the year 525, probably during repairs to the city walls after a serious flood, in a niche high above the west gate, the cloth was rediscovered and described as bearing an image made without hands. It became so famous and coveted that at last the Emperor of Byzantium sent an army to lay siege to the city until the Edessans reluctantly handed over the sacred cloth. And so the Emperor, amid the great jubilation of his people, welcomed the cloth to Byzantium. Descriptions tell us the image appeared to be a moist secretion without coloring or artificial stain, extremely blurred, and not consisting of earthly colors. Its cause seemed due to sweat, not pigments. To this day, icon painters of the Eastern Church still base their work on copies of the Edessa cloth, which they consider to be the true likeness. Wilson felt sure that this cloth and the shroud were one and the same. But why was the Edessa cloth only shown as a portrait? Early copies seemed to show it stretched on a board and covered with an ornamental trellis. Wilson formulated this theory based on an early account that it had been doubled in 4. This would have made it acceptable to King Abgar as a portrait, rather than grave clothes, which at the time of Jesus were considered untouchable. Thus the full-length image remained hidden for centuries. But where did it go from Constantinople? That question still remained. And how did it arrive at Lire in the hands of the Descharnay family? In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople was sacked and looted. The Edessa cloth simply disappeared. The French crusader Robert de Clary wrote that neither Greek nor Frenchman knew what became of it. So who came to possess it? Wilson has suggested one group of suspects with just the right qualities: powerful, fabulously rich, dealers in religious relics, and above all, obsessively secretive, the Crusader Order of Knights Templar. Strange rumors spread about them, which gave the French king the excuse he needed to destroy the order and lay his hands on their treasure. It was said that they worshipped a mysterious bearded male head, a charge which seemed inexplicable until a remarkable discovery made a few years ago in this quiet village in Somerset, England. Here in Templecombe, which was once an ancient Templar commandery, was found this painting, uncannily similar to the face on the shroud, and dating back to the times of the Templars. And there is one more crucial piece of evidence to strengthen this Templar connection. In 1314, the last Grand Master of the Templars was burned in Paris. Beside him in the flames perished one other man, and that man's name has a familiar ring. It was Geoffrey de Charnay, namesake of the other Geoffrey de Charnay, who some years later was responsible for the first expositions of the Shroud at Lire. So, for the first time, Wilson had produced a chain of historical evidence which carried the Shroud back to the one time and the one place it had to have been if it were genuinely the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And that chain of evidence was considerably strengthened when Max Fry finally completed his identification of all the pollens in his sample.
The pollen grains which confirm the presence of the shroud in Turkey were not all I had found. I had isolated many other specimens which I couldn't identify by the help of botanical textbooks. So I had to travel personally to such countries where the shroud might have been. It was quite natural to go first to Jerusalem and the surrounding wilderness of Judah. Here I found the answer. This plant is Sueda. In this particular variety, it is known only in Palestine. I found pollen from it on the shroud. And this here is Paganum harmala, a desert plant that is very frequent between Jericho and the Dead Sea. I found pollen from this plant too on the shroud.
Altogether, 8 of the species present on the shroud came from this area.
The presence of pollen from such plants growing exclusively in the land of the Bible and the surrounding deserts permits only one conclusion, that in some time of its history the shroud was exposed to the open air in Palestine.
It's difficult enough to believe that a medieval forgery could stand up so well to the kind of investigation we've seen already. But there is yet another characteristic of the image that only the most recent technology has been capable of detecting. Here, at the U.S. Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs, a professor of physics and a professor of engineering have coordinated an intensive research program into the nature of the image on the shroud. Dr. Eric Jumper and Dr. John Jackson.
As a scientist, when I became interested in the computer pictures sent back from the Mariner spacecraft near Mars, I thought that perhaps some of this technology could be applied to the shroud. So then when I was in Albuquerque, I started a rather modest attempt at this, and at that time I met Eric Jumper.
Well, the meeting that John refers to is about 3.5 years ago, and since that time we've made many interesting discoveries about the shroud. Right now we'd like to show you what we feel is one of the most interesting, and it involves the use of this machine. And we'd like to tell you exactly how it works.
We already have 2 filters of different density lined up under the television camera that you see here. The television signal is then fed into our equipment, and you can see the filters displayed on our TV monitor.
And of course what you see are 2 squares of different shades of darkness. The television signal is processed by a VP8 image analyzer, which has the ability to translate the image patterns as adjustable levels of vertical relief on this monitor. Now watch what happens as I raise the relief. As you can see, the image intensity patterns are plotted as vertical relief in proportion to the amount of darkness that you see over here. I can also rotate the image and view it from various angles.
Now, before we put a picture of the shroud under the camera, let me show you something. I have here an ordinary photograph of myself in mess dress, one which I'm sure my mother would be very proud of. And I'm going to put this under the camera. Now, John is adjusting the gain in exactly the same way as he did with the squares. I'm sure you'll agree that even my mother would have trouble recognizing me there. Now, the reason for this is very simple. A normal photograph records only variations in light and does not record information about the distance the camera was from the subject. Now we'll put a picture of the shroud under the camera.
As you can see, unlike the photograph of Eric, this image is clearly recognizable. This can only be explained if the intensity levels of the shroud image itself are encoded with distance information from the cloth to the body. There are two interesting features which are revealed by this three-dimensional display. Firstly, there appears to be some kind of object which prevented an image from being formed. Note the depression around the face and the way the hair seems to drape over it. Even the beard appears to be divided by it. Perhaps this is a chin bandage.
And St. John also speaks of a napkin or sweat cloth or handkerchief that was over his head, or earlier described as round the face of Lazarus. And I think this is clearly functional. It was, as I understand it, a piece of cloth rather like this, which was then simply folded rather like a triangular bandage and made into a chin band, which would have been functionally necessary before rigor mortis set in to bind up the jaw in this sort of manner and tie over the top of the crown.
What we're now looking at is an image of the full body. We have an image of the front and one of the back. Of course, these are the burn marks, but what we're really interested in is the image between them. We see the head, the pectorals of the chest, the two arms, and the legs, with one knee slightly raised. What's interesting is that the knee is not raised well above the chest or the head, but it looks like it's in the correct dimensions. We see that the back also has the same characteristics, and we can even see a bit of roundedness in the calf.
When I first saw this image, I think I knew how Secunda Pia must have felt when, in 1898, he saw his photographic image. As scientists, we believe that it would be practically impossible for a forger, much less a medieval one, to have produced an image like this.
Well, having looked at all the evidence you and I have just seen and tried to assess it as carefully as I can, all I can say is that for me, at any rate, the burden of proof has shifted. I began by assuming its inauthenticity until proved otherwise and asking how, as a forgery, it could possibly have been done. I now tend to assume that it's authentic and still want to know how it was done. How on earth has this image been produced on the cloth?
Of course, this question is undoubtedly the most difficult to answer. How did the image get onto the cloth? Much of the research into this has been done in the USA, and Dr. Robinson visited Colorado to discuss the subject with Dr. Jackson, Dr. Jumper, and also Dr. Donald Lynn, supervisor of image enhancement at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, who began by summarizing the situation surrounding accurate scientific dating of the cloth.
The original carbon-14 dating technique required a significant amount of material to make an accurate measurement. In fact, to get the accuracy we'd like, it would require a significant portion of the shroud. But there are techniques under development now that can give an accuracy of the order of plus or minus 50 years with a few square centimeters of material.
The obvious first thought, I suppose, must be that it was by a human hand, by some kind of painting. What do you say to that?
Well, if it was a painting, the artist would have had to use some sort of a pigment. The most likely pigment would have been an organic one.
You mean derived from plants or animals?
Exactly. Now, I think we can rule out an organic pigment. We know the cloth was exposed to a fire, and from the damage we can tell that it probably went through a very large variation in temperature, and this would have been reflected in a change in the coloration of the organic pigment. So I think we can rule that one out, because we don't see that. And I think Don also did some work on the art.
Yeah, as part of our work, we did a frequency analysis on the image of the face. And the results of this analysis indicated that there was no directionality to the image.
You mean something like brush marks?
Yes, if it was done by a human hand, you would expect to have a preferential direction or directions, and not a random orientation as we see in our images.
Well, if it wasn't put on from the outside, could it have come from the body itself by some kind of exudation made from sort of sweat and aloes?
We know from simple experiments, for instance, if I had some blood here and laid a cloth over it, the blood would soak through the cloth. But, of course, we know that the image on the shroud is strictly a surface phenomena.
Not only that, if you tried to lay the cloth over the body and produce the image by pressing it around the body, when you straightened the cloth out, you'd end up with a greatly distorted image. And the image on the shroud is not.
Well, you seem to have scotched the two most obvious hypotheses, so what are we left with?
I've made a preliminary analysis of the shroud image, and I found that the color variation of the body image and the burn marks fall along the same color curve.
So do I gather you're saying they're caused by the same process, a scorch?
Well, I'm simply saying that within the resolution of my analytic technique, I cannot discriminate between the color variation of the body image and the burn image.
In fact, a scorch would answer a few questions for us. For instance, the objection we had to the organic pigment due to the fire would not apply in this case.
Also, the fact that it's very much of a surface effect would tend to indicate that it's probably a short time scale phenomenon, such as a burst of radiation.
What do you mean by a short time?
Small fractions of a second as opposed to seconds or minutes as you'd get with a diffusion process.
So you're talking about some momentary burst of energy?
That's correct, but not enough energy to destroy the cloth.
An intense burst of radiant energy scorching the cloth in a millisecond of time. Was this what caused the image on the shroud? And perhaps at one and the same time, the phenomenon Christians call the resurrection? It's a big question, but in so many ways, in the end, the shroud seems to raise more questions than it actually answers. Is it an accident that it has survived down the centuries, awaiting an age capable of unlocking some of the secrets concealed in its shadowy stains? In the words of one writer, only this much is certain. The Shroud of Turin is either the most awesome and instructive relic of Jesus Christ in existence, or it is one of the most ingenious, most unbelievably clever products of the human mind and hand on record. It is one or the other. There is no middle ground. Which is right? Who is he?